the government has been anxious to avoid any outcropping of reverse racialism which might be expected, particularly among an ambitious younger generation. Kivukoni College in Dar es Salaam is an adult education institution, most of whose students are young people in public service. Without much training or education, many of them have been catapulted into responsible jobs formerly held by Europeans or Asians. In this seminar, they are discussing the future for the country's non-Africans as they see it.
I think the European in Tanzania has no reason to fear if at all he's a real Tanzanian. If at all the country or the people can really see to it that he's not wearing the face of a Tanzanian when he's here while he's got other objectives. I believe that most people in this country really see the point that color means nothing to them. But what is more important to this country are the services that any person can offer.
I think time of thinking that I am a European, this is African, I think it has come to an end. So we all cooperate together. Europeans and the Asians, the same.
Most of the Asians possess a very, very, very great wealth in this country. Wherever you go, you find Patels building new industries, you see. What the nation requires them to do in this country, in Tanzania, is to encourage them so that they invest their money that they already possess and not to scare them away to India or to Pakistan, you see. We should encourage them to make Tanzania as their home, you see. This is the major role they can play, I think.
Nyerere has constantly preached and practiced non-racialism and full acceptance of Tanzania's non-African minority of about 1%. This policy has never been very popular. The biggest problem comes from the nearly 100,000 Asians. Traditionally, they have been the dominant merchant class living in self-centered, separate communities. While trying to Africanize commerce, the government would like the Asians, or at least the rich ones, to remain in Tanzania and invest their money in new industries. But the fact that only half the Asian community has elected to become Tanzanian citizens indicates their state of indecision and insecurity. The European community, less than 20,000, is much smaller than the Asian community and has in general found it easier to adjust to post-independence conditions. We asked Mr. Lund for his appraisal of the situation.
Well, let us say there's been quite a push on Africanization in certain jobs, which made some people think that the Europeans as a whole was on the way out. I think that is certainly not the case. There was some confiscations of farms in Arusha district last year, or rather not confiscation of farms, it was revocation of leases, and due to certain misunderstandings, some farms which were in fact developed were also had their lease rescinded, although the obvious intention was that it should be the undeveloped ones. I think if the present government has any kind of success with its development program and so forth, I think there's certainly a future for partly private investment, and I also think for the technical experts. I think the sort of more common type European without any specific technical knowledge is limited. His future is probably limited. But otherwise, I have quite a bit of faith in this country here.
Tanzania, like many of the new African states, has a single political party, TANU, which stands for Tanganyika African National Union. These party stalwarts are forming ranks in front of TANU headquarters and marching off to an election rally. The 1965 election for the National Assembly was an important and unique demonstration of democracy in a one-party system. The degree of democracy may seem limited to those who think in terms of the established multi-party Western tradition, but viewed in the African context, this election has great significance because it gave the voters a genuine choice of candidates. Oscar Kambona is TANU's Secretary General. He is also Minister for Regional Administration, former Minister for External Affairs, and one of the most powerful men in the country.
In Britain. As far as Tanzania is concerned, it is the party which won the independence. And therefore the party has a certain significance. The parliament is an inheritance. We inherited it from the British. And at the present we are trying to change it so that it can be understood by our own people, so that they can accept it as their own instrument, their own organ. While the government does not extend up to the village level, the party extends to almost every 10 houses in the country. So that the party is looked upon as a source of culture, of pride, of achievement of our own, something which we ourselves here in Tanzania have created.
Nyerere, TANU's founder and head, is a political innovator and improviser. He has taken bold steps to support his concept of one-party democracy.
Look at what is happening. We believe we're democratic here. I hope you'll find out that we are democratic. But we have one party. We have only one party. We believe that you can develop a democratic system with one party. This is what we're trying to do.
Nyerere sometimes turned up as an observer at election rallies, lending excitement and prestige to the occasion. He was always careful not to show favoritism for either of the two opposing candidates. To be nominated, a candidate had to have solid grassroots support. First, he had to get 25 endorsements from neighbors in his local district. All candidates were then ranked by the TANU district leaders, with the top 2 being recommended to the National Executive Committee. It is most significant that the National Executive abided by the choices sent up by the district leaders in all but 10% of the constituency. The sound of the ram's horn summons the Chaga tribesmen who live on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro to an election rally. Most families here own small coffee farms. They are prosperous, independent, and politically alert. Here, as in all constituencies, rival candidates always appear at public meetings together. All expenses are paid by the party. The regional commissioner acts as a master of ceremonies and referee. He is a kind of provincial governor appointed by the central government. As many of the voters are illiterate, each of the opposing candidates is identified with one of 2 symbols, a house or a hoe. The regional commissioner explains voting procedure and displays oversized sample ballots with the house and hoe symbols. Solomon Eliufu, the incumbent, is the Minister of Education. His opponent, Mr. M.A. Aikael, is a local businessman who owns restaurants and bars. Eliufu stresses his experience in government, his superior education, and implies that his opponent has been involved in corrupt practices. His rival, on the other hand, claims that he is closer to his constituents and will be a more ardent representative of local interests.
Mpaka sasa amefanya nini katika nchi hii? Hilo ndilo neno nilikuwa nikingojea.
The regional commissioner also explains that there will be a separate ballot for the presidency.
Utapata karatasi.
Julius Nyerere is the only presidential candidate, so the ballot is to be marked either ndio, meaning yes, or hapana, no.
Rais wa Jamhuri ya Muungano wa Tanzania. Pameandikwa nini? Ndio. Pameandikwa nini? Ndio. Nini hapa pameandikwa nini? Hapana. Sasa nyinyi mnamtaka nini?
On election day, the turnout was overwhelming. Everyone over 21 can vote. More women than men did. Here in Dar es Salaam, whole families waited in line from 4 a.m. until the polls opened at 8:30. The election was carried off with scrupulous attention to honesty. There were no serious incidents to mar the orderly procedure. The young civil servant who was responsible for seeing that everything ran smoothly during the weeks of electioneering and on voting day is the 29-year-old supervisor of elections, Pius Msekwa. Msekwa's regular job is chief clerk of the National Assembly.
Now, when a person comes to register as a voter, he is issued with a card like this, which we call a voting card. It's a plain card. The face of it has only got the national coat of arms to make it look official. And inside, it has very little information. It just contains the name of the voter, the constituency in which he is entitled to vote, and the polling district, which is the smallest polling unit. So every person whose qualification we are satisfied with is issued with a card like this. Therefore, on polling day, all that is required to do is to present this card at a polling station, and he will be given a ballot paper. On voting day, a person presents his voting card. We stamp that with an official stamp to show that that card has been used. But that doesn't prevent a person going out to get a second card and claim to vote a second time. We got a system of preventing that, and we use indelible ink with which we mark some part of the voter's thumb, which remains clearly visible for 2-3 days. We have two methods of assisting illiterate voters to cast their votes. The first method is the use of symbols on the ballot paper. The symbols are only two. It has got to be either a house or a hoe. The other method is to ask our presiding officers, that is the people who are in charge of polling stations, to help mark the ballot papers of the illiterate voters.
A week after the election, with all the constituencies heard from, there was celebrating in Dar es Salaam, capped by the inauguration of Nyerere for a second 5-year term as president. But it was the results of the National Assembly contests that were the most significant, full of surprises and upsets. 2 cabinet ministers and 6 junior ministers were defeated. A number of other party stalwarts lost their seats or found them closely contested. What this seems to indicate is that on the local level, voters took full advantage of the opportunity to support candidates who represented their special interests, and to voice opposition to men who symbolized unpopular government policies like higher taxes. Thus, the Minister of Finance, Bomani, was defeated. Two weeks after his inauguration, Nyerere addressed the newly elected National Assembly at their opening session. Among other things, the election was a victory for Nyerere's policy of non-racialism. 2 cabinet ministers, the Asian Amir Jamal and the English-born Derek Bryson, both defeated African opponents, thus setting a precedent for all independent African countries. The present governmental structure has its shortcomings implicit in the fact that the present constitution is a provisional constitution. A great deal of authority is invested in the president, including the right to appoint some members of the National Assembly. But far more important than these limitations is the amount of democratic progress in a country where voting and mass political participation is a new experience. Indeed, the meticulous attention to honesty and the peaceful conduct of the 1965 elections stands in contrast to recent elections in many other parts of Africa, where the trend has been away from democracy. But while Tanzania celebrates political and nation-building advances, she remains at the mercy of forces outside her borders. How does a young and weak nation deal with the great economic and political powers of the world?
The developing countries of the world, they have been, as a group, they have been talking to the developed countries to try and perhaps prick the conscience of the developed countries about this dilemma of the developing countries. We are producers of primary products. Sometimes we have a single dominating crop like sisal. We produce We plan on the basis that prices are X, and then within a few months we find prices have dropped down, and there's nothing we can do. And this is true about our sisal, about our coffee, about our cotton. It's not merely a Tanzania problem. It is a problem facing all the primary producing countries of the world, and we are talking to the developed countries to find out what can really be done to stabilize prices.
Tanzania is primarily dependent on the West for both trade and aid. Western countries are helping with industrial development, which is still in its infancy. Nyerere and Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands open a new plant for sisal manufacture, financed by Dutch and German interests.
The policy of this factory and the others which exist and will be established in this country must be to expand production and then capture markets which are now being supplied by these other countries. It's very good indeed that the products of our new factories should break into markets where Tanzania sisal has not previously been sold.
Tanzania is trying to develop new markets. Some consumer goods from communist China are appearing in the shops, made possible through Chinese credit. But so far they haven't made much of a dent in a market dominated by European and Japanese goods. Altogether, foreign loans and grants account for at least half of the financing of Tanzanian development plans. University College is imposing evidence of foreign capital contributions. United States funds came through AID, the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations. The British government also made a sizable contribution. Some of the most effective and welcome help comes from the smaller countries not directly involved in the Cold War. Tanzanians feel that this kind of aid has fewer strings attached to it and is less of a threat to the country's integrity. A good example is the National Youth Service training, which is being supervised by an Israeli army team. These young people will be trained as a military reserve, but will simultaneously be given the discipline and technical skills needed for nation-building development projects. At the National Youth Service Camp at Ruvu, the Israeli Army officers in charge have had first-hand experience in coping with both military and agricultural problems under hardship conditions. Farm machines are strange beasts to most young Tanzanians, but looking forward to the promised agricultural transformation of the nation when tractors will be standard equipment, they become enthusiastic pupils in learning from their Israeli instructors. The camp commander, Major Lahav, and his Tanzanian assistant and understudy, Mr. Mokambiki, compare notes.
Our experts from abroad have some sort of experience which we haven't, and we take it from them and we plant it in our country. So they are fighting with the desert, we are fighting with forest and bushes.
We had the same problems, and we already had solved them. So we are helped now to solve the same problem here in Tanzania.
Amina.
The Tanzanian People's Defense Forces are now under the command of Tanzanian officers, but further training is given by Canadians. Total military strength is only about 2,000 men, but will be supplemented by National Service Reserves. This does not include the Zanzibar forces, which are virtually an independent command. Indeed, the separation of authority between the mainland and Zanzibar in the military sphere points to the basic problems in the overall relationship of the two partners in the Union. To Nyerere, Tanzania is the union of two sovereign states. He uses every opportunity to strengthen the present tenuous bond. At his inauguration, the spirit of the union was symbolized in a ceremony in which the president emptied 2 calabashes of soil from Tanganyika and Zanzibar into a common bowl. Then, as he reviewed the troops of both armies, he was flanked by his 2 vice presidents. First Vice President Karume, who was formerly president of Zanzibar, on his right, and Second Vice President Kawawa from the mainland on his left. Viewed from the outside, it is difficult to see why Nyerere places so much importance on the union with the tiny offshore Zanzibar islands, whose population of 300,000 is a mere 3% of the country's total. We can probably find the explanation in Nyerere's great dreams and disappointments concerning African destiny. With total continental African unity only a dim hope, and the ties of East African solidarity melting away, the Tanzanian Union looms symbolically large.
My country, Tanzania, is a little symbol of unity between what previously were 2 sovereign states. We are working very closely with our colleagues in East Africa and very closely with our colleagues in the Organization of African Unity, patiently.
The Tanzanian Union, dating from April 1964, is still young and fragile. 3 months earlier, an African Revolutionary Council had seized control in Zanzibar and installed Karume as president. Unlike Tanganyika, the transfer of the government to the African majority in Zanzibar followed a brief but bloody upheaval. The Sultan and ruling Arab minority were deposed. Uncounted numbers of Arabs were killed while others fled. The violence reflected long-suppressed racial fears and hatred. For centuries, the port of Zanzibar, now a city of 60,000, had been the central market for the Arab slave and ivory trade. More recently, Zanzibar became known as the Clove Islands. Its clove trees yield 80% of the world's supply. Again, in contrast to Tanganyika, Zanzibar has traded primarily with Indonesia, India, and other Asian countries. Today, Zanzibar is aligned with the East and communist bloc countries for both trade and aid. Since the Union, communist funds still go directly to Zanzibar, bypassing the central government in Dar es Salaam. The East Germans have spent almost $1.5 million on this housing project. The army is trained and equipped by the USSR and by the People's Republic of China. Its strength of about 1,000 is roughly half that of the Tanzanian forces on the mainland. As we have noted, there is officially only one force, but in reality, this Zanzibar brigadier is in full command of an independent army. The young pioneers, both boys and girls, are also armed and well-disciplined. Nyerere finds himself in the delicate position of trying to sustain and strengthen the Union without military power or economic leverage. Characteristically, he is relying on patient persuasion backed up with generous concessions. Zanzibar fills about 1/4 of the seats in the National Assembly and has 4 cabinet ministers in the central government. Nyerere campaigned in Zanzibar prior to the presidential election and got a relatively greater vote there than on the mainland. There are indications like this that his tactics are paying off, but it's too soon to be sure. If the Union does hold together, once again Nyerere will have succeeded where other African states have failed. In a further expression of his hopes for African unity, Nyerere has given shelter to many exiled groups fostering African majority rule in territories remaining under white domination. This includes Rhodesia, the Portuguese colonies, and South Africa. Thus, Tanzania has been the host country to the Organization of African Unity's Liberation Committee, with Oscar Kambona serving as its first chairman.
As we were the first country to be free on the eastern part of Africa, the freedom fighters or the leaders of freedom movements, the whole of Africa, came to stay here in Dar es Salaam, and they're staying. And then it is easy also for the Liberation Committee to get in touch with the freedom fighting leaders, because then they're around us here.
Nyerere's insistence on majority self-rule in Rhodesia expresses his belief that Africans must take collective responsibility for African problems. At the same time, he realizes that his country is entirely at the mercy of the great powers in relation to the Cold War.
In the power politics, we find that the power blocs would prefer that we choose one side, and we cling to that one side. The idea that we should look at them and say, we don't understand your quarrels, or we don't want to be involved in your quarrels, this they find difficult to understand. They would rather we pick China and we say we want to be a satellite of China, or we pick the United States and be a satellite of the United States. Actually, if we did either of those, they would still be accused. Or we would still be accused of doing the wrong thing.
Non-alignment in Tanzania and elsewhere in the world generally arouses unpleasant suspicions in the United States. Our ties with Nyerere, which commenced with great cordiality and sympathy, began to deteriorate. By 1964, during the Congo airlift, and later with Zhou Enlai's visit to Tanzania, relations reached a low point of mutual mistrust and hostility, fanned by inflammatory press reports on both sides. Kivukoni students expressed the views on non-alignment and the United States currently shared by most of Tanzania's better-informed citizens.
What America needs to understand and always bear in mind is that we are an independent nation, and as such, we have committed ourselves to the policy of non-alignment. We really aren't interested in what ideological differences there are between America and China. We are able to make our own minds, and this is exactly what it means to be independent. Therefore, if at all we see that this thing is good is good for this country and it comes from America, okay. If this thing is good and it comes from China, okay. Now, over there we know there is America, over there is China. There are some differences between those two countries. We are not Chinese, we are not Americans, but we are Tanzanians. Therefore, we have to think like Tanzanians, and we act like Tanzanians and decide like Tanzanians, not like Chinese or not like Americans. Now, what worries you people is that you want us, what Americans want is that they want us to behave, no, to think like Americans. Or no, to commit ourselves to Americans so that we dislike the Chinese. And we have no reason to dislike the Chinese. And then maybe there is a power bloc in the East which wants us to dislike the Americans. We have no reason to dislike the Americans.
In addition,
if at all a situation comes up that might bring some differences between Tanzanians and Americans, well, that is a situation which we have to meet as it appears. But as such, we have no reason just to wake up one morning and say, now to hell with America. Why?
Another point is that Americans and the Chinese think that through the aids they give to Tanganyika, they could say anything to Tanzania. Tanzania is not worried because of what they give to Tanzania at all. They should understand that whatever they give it on their own will. And we are not to follow what they do or give to us because they have assisted us in certain things.
We are after one thing, development, economic development. I think you have seen our 5-year plan or have heard of it. And in that, we still pray, if possible, U.S., you the U.S., and them the Chinese to help us. That's what we are after. We are not
clinged to one place. When it doesn't matter how many million US can be in here or how many million Chinese can be here. If they can help us in the right way we choose to be helped, that's what we're after. We can make
already advocated our views open to the world by the number of students who are schooling abroad. We have, I think, more students schooling in West countries than in East countries. This alone proves that we are not hating West because we need their help as well as East.
Again, I actually ask a question and answer it myself. It's about why doesn't China become worried since we have got so many American Peace Corps here, and I think we have none of the Chinese Peace Corps here. Moreover, China is not worried at all. Why is America so worried?
We are a symbol of China. This is something we don't understand. And mind you, this is an extremely serious thing because my people ask, my more intelligent people ask, what is it the Westerns are interested in our countries? Friendship or beyond? What is it? We are very friendly. We have thousands of Americans working in my country here, in the schools, in businesses, everywhere. How do we prove our friendship?
Perhaps the best way we in the United States can reply to Nyerere's question is to make it unnecessary, show that we value Tanzania's independence and survival more than her commitment to our struggles, and accept without rancor her posture of non-alignment in the Cold War. Julius Nyerere is a quiet revolutionary, advocating the growth of democracy, a mixture of socialism and private enterprise, non-racialism, and an Africa united under African rule. As a nation, Tanzania is still young and very poor. To grow strong, she will need the continued commitment of her people and her friends among the great and rich nations. Nyerere pilots a fragile ship of state. It is in our best interest that it does not founder.